Okay, so I'm being flexible. I've changed the exercise already I was going to do. That was an exercise, changed that to this one. I actually did this as a quote directly from what you said the philosophy of the institution was. So in case you don't know, this is from your website, I think.
Good.
Yeah, the number of principles. Just check that you know this. So I'm sure you say this every night before you go to bed. It helps you get to sleep. But that's actually on your website. So it seems to be relevant what we're talking about. You actually say your teaching and learning philosophy involves that relationship between staff and students. And we began to talk about students as partners this morning, but it also is one emphasising active learning. So we're really actually exploring that, and that's why I want to learn from you as well of things that you do already in that philosophy, because I know you're all embedded in the philosophy and that, which is great. So I thought I'd just show, I have looked at your website.
Find one person here.
So this is the framework for this afternoon, and for those who weren't here this morning, the way I run the workshop is it's lots of activities. I know an out-based curriculum is something which is important here, so I want to say a few words about outcomes-based curriculum. Stand back from it and ask the question about how do students learn and what can we learn from that. Implementing active learning in the curriculum, integrating inquiry-based learning activities in the curriculum, a little action planning at the end. But we will finish by 4:45, 3 hours from now. So I want to start with out-based curriculum. Many of you will be very familiar with John Biggs's work of aligned curriculum. It's very common, underlies a lot of the thinking right around certainly much of higher education. And it's really a very simple idea that there should be some alignment between the learning outcomes, the assessment tasks, and the teaching and learning experiences. And before that came along, there was often a disconnect between those. They didn't actually align. We didn't actually define learning outcomes at all. We just taught a course and we assessed it in some ways. And it's been very valuable in making us just stand back and make them explicit on what the links are. So I think that's a start for a lot of the out-based curriculum. But things have moved on a little bit since John Biggs. I was actually asked to write a foreword for a book, so I had to read the book first, about a learning-centred curriculum design. And they had this nice, and you know from this morning I like these 2x2 diagrams. What we tend to talk traditionally in the learning outcomes, we talk a lot about what students learn, the bottom. We might talk about what we do to design the curriculum. That's where most activities are at. But they said, actually, we need to look not only about what students learn, but how they learn, the learning process. And equally, probably the thing we pay least attention to is the curriculum design process, how we went about designing the course. And they use that as a structure for that book. And they mapped the chapters in different quadrants where the chapter was about it. And they had chapters which fitted into each quadrant. So that was their, if you like, their framework for the book. And it covers all four. So if you're interested in learning-centred curriculum design, it's a good book to have a look at. One of the chapters in that made a distinction I think is also very useful about a tutor-centric approach to curriculum design and a student-centred approach. And I think, again, that made it explicit. The ideas, I think, will be very familiar with you, but this is quite a conventional one, what we tend to do as tutors. We start with the outcomes. What do we want the students to be able to do at the end of the course they couldn't do at the beginning? That's the classic definition of a learning outcome for the course. You'll be very familiar. What we tend to do then is say, well, what does the student need to know in order to do this well? That's the content, the subject matter. We spend most of our attention, in that box. We then go on, well, what activities will facilitate that learning? What are the teaching methods, the pedagogy which underpins that? We then say, well, how will the students be able to demonstrate it? That's the assessment. And how will we know they've demonstrated it? That's the assessment criteria. And that's quite a very common one. But actually, it's centred on us as the course designers. And what they argue is, actually, perhaps we ought to flip that round and be more student-centred in our design approach. And they simply move the boxes around. So they start with the outcomes, the learning outcomes at the beginning. What then they do is go straight to assessment. And they say, well, how will we know the students can do this? That's the question they ask. What are the criteria? only at that point do they say what are the knowledge and skills we want them to learn, and what are the pedagogy. That. And simply changing the order in which you approach that gives you a new frame, and it's much more student-centered, because they always are, is it on the test? What's the assessment? How will we know that? And that's how it drives their behaviour. Perhaps it should drive some of our behaviour in the sense of thinking about that, and that will get alignment in a slightly different context. So just share that idea with you. It might be a useful one. I want to now come to how do we learn. This is an exercise that Phil Race has used tens of thousands of times, mainly in a university context with both staff and with students, but also he's done it with primary school kids. He's done it with old age pensioners. He's gone across the whole spectrum of lifelong learning. And he asked some very simple questions. I'm not going to. It says write down. I'm not going to ask you to write down, but I want you to think of something you're good at. Now, you don't be modest. I'm not going to ask you what it is, so you don't have to be embarrassed and admit it. It would be quite interesting. I did, I think, but I won't. I want you to tell me in just a few words, explaining how you became good at it, whatever it was. So just shout out some words which describe how you became good at it.
Practice.
Practice.
Demonstration.
Demonstration.
Failure.
Sorry?
Failure.
Failure. Yeah. You learn through failure. Very powerful way of learning. Yes? Any other words to describe how you became good at it?
Reflection.
Reflection on it.
Guidance.
Guidance. That's an unusual one, actually. But any other words to describe? Practice. Yes, we had that again. That's fine.
Teach.
So you teach? You were taught it? Yeah. Or you taught somebody else and you became good at it? So which?
I think that's a very good way of learning.
So you taught somebody, and that's how you became good at it. Yes. Not that you were taught it, but you taught somebody else. Yeah, that's much more active. Yeah, I love that one. Yeah. Best way to learn is teach somebody else. Yeah. Any other words that describe that?
I think motivation is important.
Yes, yeah, you've got to be motivated. That underpins a lot of this. Well, 4 words come up very commonly. Others come up, but 4 predominate. And you mentioned that, practice. It's the very first word there. The doing it, the trial and error, the error element, or getting it wrong at first and learning from your mistakes. Now, we've added 1 or 2 other ones to that, but those are the 4 most common ones that come up numerous times there. Now, I want you to think more in emotional terms, in feeling terms. So this time, I want you to think of something about yourself which makes you feel good. It's some sort of personal quality. It gives you a bit of a glow, as they said. I'm certainly not going to ask what it is. Don't want to embarrass people. But just tell me in words, how would you explain why you feel good about it? On what evidence do you base those positive feelings? Give me some words to say what underpins, what evidence you base those positive feelings about what you feel good about it.
Reaction.
Reaction of other people. Presumably positive reaction. Yeah. Quite important. So, appreciation. It could be related, in other words, to describe it. Yes?
Resilience.
Resilience. That's an interesting one. What else you got?
What did you say, Paul? Experience?
Positive feedback.
Oh,
In a
experience.
sense. Yes. Experience. Yeah. Any other terms?
It's tough to think of evidence.
Yeah, well,
I should be able to figure that out.
well, why do you feel good about it? Because
It makes you feel good.
it makes you feel good. Oh, yes. That's right. Yes. I know one when I see one. It's that sort of answer. Okay. Again, relatively few words come up. Reactions of other people, feedback, compliments, seeing the results. I don't think we had the last one, but the other 3 came up in various... We had different words to describe these, but these underpin them. Okay, we've looked at the positive side. Let's look at the negative side for a moment now. This is an unsuccessful learning experience you've had. You've all had that. We've all been wounded and still got the scars. So something you don't do well, an unsuccessful learning experience. Tell me some causes of that unsuccessful learning experience. What went wrong?
Not
I
enough
didn't
time.
work hard enough.
You didn't work hard enough. Yeah, I didn't put the effort in. Yours?
Not enough time.
Not enough time.
Carelessness.
Carelessness. Demotivated. Isn't it interesting how we get the words for unsuccessful and they come out easier than they do the positive ones? Yeah. We have lots of excuses for why not learning didn't take place. Any other words to describe your unsuccessful learning experience? What went wrong?
Frustration.
Frustration? Yeah.
Did not work hard enough.
You didn't put the effort in? Yeah.
No luck.
Yeah. No luck. No luck. No knowledge.
No knowledge.
Yeah. Lack of motivation. Yeah. All these. And actually, Phil gets far more words to describe unsuccessful learning experiences than he does successful ones. I think the psychologists could have a field day with us. But these are some of the words which come out. I won't read them. You can see them on the screen.
Bad feedback. Wow.
So, Mick, are you going
Please.
to share this?
Yes, I'll make all the slides available. So yeah. So we had some of those. We had a few more excuses that we've had, but those are the common ones. Okay, so we've got some ideas there about what makes success, what gives a good feeling, and what characterises unsuccessful learning. And Phil really used this as an evidence to develop a learning model about how we learn. And he really came up with these 5 key factors, each of which is split down into another couple. So all learning starts with wanting to learn. It's got to have motivation, there's got to be interest there. Then there's got to be a need to learn. There's got to be some necessity to learn. That could be related to motivation. It could be saving face in some cases. If you're swimming, it could be rather more serious than that. Learning to swim, the consequences of not being able to do it. There's how you learn, there's the doing of it. That's what we tend to put a lot of emphasis. The practice, the trial and error. There's what he calls digesting. We might call that reflection. Making sense of it. Gaining ownership. And then there's getting feedback, both particularly other people's reactions, and seeing the results of what we do. These are really the critical ones. He says underpin learning from digesting his own digestion of all these feedbacks he's got from those questions that he's asked. Now, his own learning has developed over time. So his first model was a very simple model, a sort of learning cycle model. Some of you will know Kolb's experiential learning model. I like Phil's ones because Kolb's one, he uses psychological terms, abstracts. I never remember the terms, they're psychological terms. I can remember wanting, needing, doing, feedback, digesting. It speaks my language, so it's easier to remember. So he started with that model, but he got a bit dissatisfied with this after a while because it suggests it goes in a particular order. And actually learning is more messy than that. It needn't go strictly in that particular order. You can start in different places and go in different directions. And he came up with an analogy of throwing a pebble into a pond. And if you throw a pebble in, you see ripples, and they seem to go in both directions. So it's a ripple-based model that he developed. And there's some rather nasty sounds, I'll warn you, coming up now. It gets the idea of having ripples there. The core one and the centre, I think, of all learning is wanting, needing. That's the motivation. If you haven't got that, the rest is not going to follow. But having got that, that's where the pebble hits the pond. You then get these ripples going backwards and forwards, and they can go in any direction in any one, so you can jump around. The doing, the digesting, and the feedback. So that was his second model, is pebbles in a pond model of learning. Over time, he's reflected and actually said there are some other factors which are not included in there, particularly related to teaching in a higher education context. So he's asked another question, a couple of questions. First one, think of something that you've taught for some time. How many of you are actually actively teaching? The one or two of you, perhaps not, virtually everybody. Mimic this if you haven't, role play it. Think back to the first time that you taught that particular course. So it may be several years in some, others it might be more recent. and give you some choices. To what extent did you find that you had your head around it much better after teaching for the first time? Very much better, you raised 2 hands. Somewhat better, you raised 1 hand. And if it made no difference, you can keep your hands to yourself. One of the ways we learn is by teaching somebody else. And we learn about it ourselves, and we often learn more about it than they necessarily do, the best way. But ironically, we don't put students into that situation as often as I think we ought to. If that's the way we learn, well, why not get students teaching each other? Because it's a very effective way of them learning. Put them into situations of peer learning, possibly peer assessment, but that needn't necessarily be there. We had a little bit of discussion on that this morning, but that's one of the arguments for doing it. So we'll add another box to that. Coaching, explaining, teaching, give the various terms which might help learning to take place more generally. One more question. This time, think of something, again, you taught a particular topic. Think back to the first time you measured the students' learning of the topic. In other words, to what extent did you find that after you'd done the assessment of your students' work, you yourself had made more sense of the topic? Some of you made no difference, some of you made less. So we had a range, probably on average less. And that is quite common. It seems that teaching something really makes a huge difference. Assessing it makes some difference to some people in some contexts. There. But it's enough there to say, well, let's add another ring to that, and that's assessing or making informed judgments around generalising that to learning taking place. So what we've ended up there is a rather more complex model of the factors influencing student learning, or influencing learning generally. So he argues, and this is on the handout, we can make learning happen by striving to enhance our students' want to learn, the motivation, helping students develop ownership of the need to learn, keeping students learning by doing, practice, trial and error, repetition, ensuring students get quick and useful feedback from both us and each other, helping students make sense of what they learn, getting students to deepen their learning by coaching or teaching other students, explaining things to each other, and allowing students to further deepen their learning by perhaps assessing their own learning and making some informed judgments on it. Now, much of what we tend to do, I think, is in this area of giving them some activities to do and testing them and giving them some feedback. But actually, he's saying we need to take a broader gun. We need to take some responsibility for them wanting to learn and persuading them of the need to learn. And that's the key one in many ways, because learning is not going to take place. And doing some other things which will reinforce that learning process. So I think there were some lessons from that. But what really interested me of that one, and it comes up very rarely, is people very rarely say, though it did come up in one person's comment, that they learned something because they were taught it. That rarely comes up as something we say we learnt a successful learning experience because we were taught it. What do we do though? In most classes, we teach them. We do a transmission mode of teaching, do a lot of lecturing, but it's not how we learnt, so how do we expect the students necessarily to learn by that method? And that goes back to the basis of active learning. A lot of research evidence, we'll play some of that during this afternoon, that you need to involve the students actively in the learning for learning to take place, the deepen of attention. Simply teaching them is not enough. So any comments about how students learn and what the implications of that are? Please.
When you talked about learning outcomes, you suggested learning to do something. And I think your point about teaching helps them to do something.
Yeah.
But sometimes you're teaching so they know something.
Yeah.
And you can learn to know something by teaching. If someone's, you must know, the 5 steps of this or whatever, without doing.
Yeah, I think it's the reinforcement and that. Simply being told doesn't tend to change people's behaviour, or they can learn it for the test. That's the rote learning one, and reproducing it, and very common in lots of societies, but particularly traditionally in Southeast Asia. They're very good at learning. That's how they get the credit for it. But the evidence shows that if they want deep and retained learning, they've got to internalise that. And some ways of doing that activity is and getting some feedback on it and reflecting on that. The other stages of the learning reinforce that. So it's moving from a transmission mode to a more student-centred mode. I'm not denying the importance of it and providing that information, but actually the definition of a learning outcome is some knowledge or skill that you have at the end of the course you didn't have at the beginning. And that can be both knowledge and skill. It's not just activity related, but doing activities is a way of getting that knowledge as well. Yeah. Any other comments or questions or reflections on that?
I'd say the hardest part of that in a class context is number 4, being able to give them quick and useful feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, I agreed. It's a huge problem, and in a sense, I think it's a bit easier in your idea in the North American system, where you do lots of mini assessments, and then they can get that feedback. One very good way of getting quick feedback is doing a class test where there are some answers and perhaps you're using the clickers or on the mobile phones, so they get immediate feedback of their understanding. Often we do that actually to help to give you feedback about the understanding that the class has, but they also get feedback themselves about whether they're understanding. It works both ways, and it's a very quick response. But it does mean doing something actively early on. In the UK, we spend a lot of end of module assessment. By the time we've learned from that, it's too late. They've moved on. And very few people collect their assignment. You spend all that time making the comments, and nobody comes and collects the assignment, so they never even get the feedback. They don't read the feedback. All they look is, have I got the mark? And, that's a great issue about how you do that. And while I just mentioned that as an issue, one way of doing that, I know colleagues who don't give the mark until the students read the feedback, and then they will declare the marks. So you have to read the feedback first, and even have a meeting perhaps with the tutor to discuss it sometimes, if it's a smaller class, before they get the marks. So that you're trying to get them to engage with the feedback that you've given on that assignment.